After a brutal war and territories that have been captured and recaptured by government and rebel forces, followed by relative stability, a dramatic turn of events saw the country's largest rebel group take over its second largest city. All this bringing about fresh fears that a civil war could be reignited. By Friday last week, Syrian rebel forces opposed to President Bashar Al Assad's rule launched a surprise offensive, taking over the city of Aleppo from government control. The offensive was led by the Hayat Tahrir Al Sham militant group known as HTS. In just 2 days, they had gotten Aleppo under their rule, making further advancements to expand their territorial gains. In the days that followed, Syrian and Russian jets carried out airstrikes on the rebel-held city of Idlib in the northwest of the country, where the HTS had kept their control there since 2017. Syria's civil war started in 2011, after uprisings against President Assad's rule were met with brutal crackdowns, turning into a bloody, divisive war over the next 14 years. By 2020, a truce was brokered by Turkey and Russia, bringing the fighting in northwest Syria to a standstill. But the fragility of this deal is best reflected by what UN Envoy for Syria Geir Pedersen said, warning against the risks of escalation, where only conflict management measures were taken rather than conflict resolution. Quote, "No Syrian party or existing group of actors can resolve the Syrian conflict via military means," he said. The scale and the speed of what HTS did have sent shockwaves across the region, cutting short a brief moment of relief over the ceasefire agreement between Hezbollah and Israel in neighboring Lebanon. With so many international actors, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Hezbollah itself, to name a few, also involved in the conflict, many questions loom over what this rebellion means and what will happen next. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we take a look at how the events of the past week have unfolded in Syria. We examine the role of the many non-state actors on the ground in these latest clashes and how renewed fighting may change the dynamics in the war-torn country. Before the rebels advanced in their quest to take over key parts of Syria, vast territory was already under government control, particularly in the south. But further north, several different areas were controlled by a number of groups, including HTS and other opposition fighters, as well as Kurdish-led forces near the border with Turkey. The exception was government-controlled Aleppo, which has now been captured in the offensive. Lizzie Porter, the National's Turkey-based correspondent, explains what happened on the ground.
In the past, Aleppo was taken over the course of this conflict, which has now gone on for nearly 14 years. Rebels took the city of Aleppo, and it took years of fighting with Russian and Iranian support for the regime to take it back. Now, in just 3 days, the rebels were able to take it back from the regime forces. So, I mean, even the opposition themselves have said that they were shocked and surprised at how fast they were able to advance in the face of Syrian army and its allies, forces who seemed to melt away or crumble away very, very quickly. So in addition to Aleppo, those forces are now moving southeast of Aleppo, and they are also moving south from Idlib province. They took the whole of Idlib province, and now they're moving towards Hama, and they say eventually Damascus, the capital. In addition to this, you've got another slightly different group of Syrian opposition forces, mostly backed by Turkey, who have been trying to take and have taken areas that have been long held by Kurdish militias. These Turkish-backed forces see the Kurds as Assad allies and as terrorists, as does Turkey. So there's been, huge changes in the front lines here, or in the frozen front lines, I should say, in less than a week.
Much of the country is under government control. So what makes Aleppo specifically such a strategic first city to capture for the rebels?
Aleppo is the industrial center of Syria and the business and trade capital, while Damascus is the political center. And it's also very symbolic for the opposition to Assad, in that this was one of the centers of the revolution that started in 2011, which eventually spiraled and turned into a war with the big crackdowns that took place by Assad, it was a center of people who supported the opposition forces and was under siege for years by Assad and Russia and Iranian allies, when was eventually taken back by them at the end of 2016.
Lizzie, we've seen the offensive affect different civilian populations in many different ways. Some have had to flee their homes, while others have been able to reunite with the families that they have been missing for years after being apart. Can you describe how the residents of the affected areas have been impacted over the past week?
There are people who were displaced into Idlib because they fled Assad government forces in the past, and they have come back to Aleppo. And, there were pictures of people running through the streets and hugging their families and crying, and not only in Aleppo, but also in places in Idlib, which were taken by Assad and were retaken in the past week by rebels. Other people have, not knowing what is going to happen, the taking over of Aleppo by essentially rebel insurgent groups, many of whom are, not all, but, many of whom do have Islamist tendencies. They aren't sure what's going to happen, and they are scared, and they have tried to flee. Not necessarily just Christians, etc., but people who thought that they might be punished for having remained in Aleppo while Assad was there. Another population movement we've got is of Kurds. So when the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, they call themselves, and they are not the Syrian Arab Army, they are not the Assad army, they are an opposition army backed by Turkey. They took previously Kurdish-held areas like Tel Rifat. Some Kurds who were living in Tel Rifat left. Another big cause of population movement is aerial bombings. While Russia's help or aid to Assad has been characterized by lots of analysts and experts as quite low and, absent, in the past few days, we've seen an uptick in bombings. A lot of people are blaming it on the Russian Air Force of bombings of civilian areas in Idlib, as what they say are kind of, or what people on the ground are saying is a kind of retribution for this big operation and taking of land from Assad. So we've had dozens killed and thousands of people displaced.
So we know that this offensive was led by HTS. But do we know if this was a solo effort, or have we seen more of a united front between them and other rebel groups?
Yes, Hayat Tahrir Al Sham has kind of led the charge, as it were. But, speaking to rebel commanders and opposition politicians, this was not just Hayat Tahrir Al Sham. So you have this other kind of coalition called the Syrian National Army, and they are the ones directly backed by Turkey. And within the Syrian National Army, they are also a panoply of groups. They are, a wide umbrella. It's not just one sort of brigade. Some of them are more Islamist, some of them are more pro-Turkey. They have fights between each other. Some of them are closer to HTS, some of them don't get on so well with HTS. And I was asking a commander for numbers this morning, and he said it's very difficult to actually know how many rebels are taking part in this, because sometimes it was people who sort of decided to join along the way as their villages were, taken back by opposition forces. I've seen estimates of it being 2/3 HTS and 1/3 Syrian National Army. Others saying that's fluid and it's changing all the time. So it's not just HTS.
So we've seen Russia stepping in to provide, obviously, support to President Assad, as we saw with the aerial campaigns. But do we know more about government forces' plans after the takeover of Aleppo? Are they retreating or are they regrouping to take back the city?
We know that the Assad has kind of tried to bring some forces towards Hama. Look, the Syrian army has been kind of beleaguered for years. They have been conscripts. They are undertrained, underfed, underpaid. The big questions that I have are if this continues, will the Syrian army muster what it has to defend the remaining cities, so Homs and Damascus, because any kind of big assault on Damascus would be the first nail for Assad. But there is also the possibility that they do regroup and mount some sort of counterattack, particularly if Russia says, okay, well, we'll keep striking from the sky then.
Clashes are still ongoing in Syria since the takeover of Aleppo, and it's hard to know exactly what will happen next. It's also difficult to see how all of this came seemingly out of the blue. Arwa Ajoub is a PhD candidate at Malmo University researching Islamist groups in Syria. I asked him whether there were any signs that this rebellion may have been coming.
The whole operation is not surprising. Jurani, he is the leader of Hayat Tahrir Al Sham, HTS. So he has been talking about it in public media. You could see some videos for him now 6 months ago where he was saying, I'm going to see you in Aleppo. We will liberate Aleppo. So there was a lot of media talk, right? But Syria analysts and many others, and I think I'm included in that sense, we thought that the line of conflict have been frozen. And indeed, they were frozen until last week. We have Idlib, which run by Hayat Tahrir Al Sham. We have 3 different pockets run by Syrian National Army in northern Syria. And we have the Syrian regime, which managed to post control over some part of the western region. We thought that this line of conflict were very solid, consolidated. So in that sense, it was like surprising.
Arwa, the timing seems very intentional, doesn't it? It came just a day or 2 after the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And as we know, Hezbollah is very much allied with the Assad regime and has some of the same backers. What does the timing and the nature of this operation by HTS tell us?
The context is very important. Why now? I think why now and what kind of explained the scale. So why now? I mean, Russia's attention has been very much divided, right, between Ukraine and Syria. The second thing is Iran. Iran received a big blow during the war between Israel and Hamas, and during the war between Israel and Hezbollah. And of course, Hezbollah received a huge strike, after the killing of his leaders, top commanders, a chain and command. There was this feeling, I think, between the axis of resistance, as they call themselves, is that basically Assad distanced himself as much as possible during the war. So we saw some reports that Assad asking Hezbollah to close their offices in Damascus. We saw some reports that Assad is trying to tell the Iranians that he doesn't want to be part of this larger escalation. The other is that Hezbollah and the Iranian militias were pretty much occupied with the war with Israel. So they were not really prepared. When it comes to the scale was surprising because we were not aware how much Assad was relying on Hezbollah and Iranian militias to protect these regions, right? Additionally, the Syrian army is really tired, exhausted. Some of its personnel, troops have been fighting for a decade now. Many of them, they are not receiving well enough salaries. Many of them, there is no real cause to fight for at the moment.
The US had said it had no role in the fighting and even designated HTS as a terrorist organization. But historically, it and other Western states have backed opposition against Bashar al Assad. So what's their position on this at the moment?
Now, the last 2 months of Biden's administration, there is some sort of political vacuums that the current president, cannot really change much yet. So the question becomes, when Trump comes to office, will he withdraw the 900 troops in northeast Syria? When he was president, he mentioned this several times that he was willing to withdraw these forces. But after the 7th of October, I think the calculus must change. And I'm not sure that if Trump is still willing to do so, allowing Iranians to have their own corridor between Syria and Lebanon.
Turkey is also involved. As we said, there are many players in the conflict. Can you tell us how and what is the stake they have in all of this?
Turkey at the very beginning was very vague about its involvement. It was like, we want stability for Syria and we have nothing to do with the escalation. However, as time unfolds, you realize that this is not particularly the case because, for example, the Syrian National Army, funded, supported, trained by Turkey, took Tel Rifat, which is a Syrian Democratic Forces area in northern Syria. So Turkey has talked about this for a long time. It has carried out four military operations through which it managed to occupy large swath of territories and then instilling the Syrian National Army there. But it has always wanted to take Tarrafat. Tarrafat is like really a jewelry for Turkey to kind of, minimize the danger of the Syrian Democratic Forces close to its borders.
As we know, Israel has been striking Syria quite frequently in recent months with no response, seemingly, no retaliation from the Syrian side at all. Did this factor in at all in any way? And what do the type of weapons that the HES is using tell us about who they are being backed by?
Both are good questions. The first one, when it comes to Assad's reaction to the Israeli strike on Syria, I mean, let's be honest about this. Assad has no capacity to retaliate. When the war started in Gaza and then in Lebanon, I think there has been some sort of expectations from Iran that Assad will take larger role in the fight against Israel. But what we saw instead is that Assad, not publicly, but people on the ground could see this. Assad was trying to distance himself. And not only so, Assad has been also trying to mend fences with Iran's rivals in the region. The second question has to do with the HTS weaponry, right? I mean, let's not forget, HTS has been fighting now for years, right? So they have accumulated a lot of experiences in making weapons, in military plans. I've seen some reports or like some people, for example, saying that, oh, this must come from Turkey, like especially talking about the drones. I don't know. I'm not a military expert. However, I mean, from what I see, these are very primitive drones. The majority of them are kamikaze drones, not that sophisticated. They don't fly for long range. They are easy detectable. It's incomparable with the Turkish expertise when it comes to drones. So I doubt that Turkey has been taking part in, equipping the opposition and HTS in particular with such technology. Okay, HTS deal with Turkey and they have some sort of relationship, but it's not like SNA-Turkey relationship because let's not forget, until this moment, the moment we speak, HTS is listed as terrorist organization in Turkey.
So are you saying that HTS is benefiting from Turkey indirectly?
Think about it like this. Turkey controls Bab al-Hawa crossing from Turkish side, HTS controlled from the Syrian side, right? It's the lifeline of Turkey, of HTS areas. So you got to deal with HTS. There is no way not to deal with HTS, right? But in terms of military support, I doubt there has been any kind of military support. Could be, I mean, it might transpire by time that we know that Turkey, for example, provided intelligence for this operation, right? But this kind of collaboration, I would say, rather than supporting it, whether with money or with troops or with technology.
Last year, President Assad was welcomed back into the Arab League. Could this change dynamic? Could the Arab states that have welcomed him back actually play a role or have a bearing in what happens next in Syria?
I think when these initiatives started to talk with Assad, they were driven by different factors that they could be driven by today. So one of the factors that, Assad is trafficking drugs through his networks to different parts of the world, to the Gulf. So part of the rationale, I would say that, in kind of engaging with Assad could maybe find a solution for this. The second thing is pushing Assad a little bit outside of the Iranian influence. And I think that was reflected in the relationship between Assad and Iran. And as I said before, like him distancing himself from the axis of resistance and kind of like leaning towards the Gulf state in a way was a negative sign for Iran.
The region is bracing itself now for more bloodshed after so much turmoil over the past year in Gaza and in Lebanon. What should we be thinking about for the future as the situation in Syria continues to develop and potentially deteriorate?
There is like future question that needs to be kept in mind all the time. The question is, for example, what kind of governance do we expect in these areas taken by the oppositions? Because there are different demographic compositions within them. We saw really good examples in Aleppo where the Christians celebrated their religious occasions We saw also some interviews with Christian locals in these areas, asking them about how they think about everything. Has they been affected by the opposition advancement? The question becomes is that will HTS continue to take into consideration these dynamics? Additionally, the question in the future would be is to what extent we could see a coexistence between HTS and SNA, because there's a lot of bad blood there, right? It won't fit if people from, for example, Idlib or SNA areas come to, for example, govern Aleppo. Aleppo needs to be governed by its own people. So the question of governance is really important. And of course, I think there is a lot of fear among people in Syria, like, oh, what are these people going to do? I think it's reasonable to have this fear, but I also think that on the ground, what we see on the ground is not as people describing in the media. It doesn't really requires a lot of fear.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. This is a fast developing story, but our team of reporters continues to cover the latest as it happens on the website, thenationalnews.com. Follow our coverage there to stay up to date with everything that's happening. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer, and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.